February 14th, 1971. Valentine's Day. 9 people were found dead across 2 farmhouses in the Norfolk Fens, shot and beaten in what investigators would describe as the most violent rural crime in East Anglian history. The local newspapers called it a farming dispute gone wrong. The national press called it a bloodbath. But the truth required understanding something most city people never think about: where water goes when it rains in the flattest landscape in England, who controls it, who profits from controlling it, and what happens when one man decides to use that control as a weapon against his neighbor for 30 years until the neighbor finally breaks. This is the story of Arthur William Drake, a Norfolk farmer who spent 3 decades watching his crops drown while his neighbor grew rich, who exhausted every legal avenue available to him, who lost everything he'd built, and who on Valentine's Day 1971 decided that if the law wouldn't protect him, then he would protect himself. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events from rural England. The Norfolk Fens in 1971 were a landscape unlike anywhere else in Britain, flat and wide and ancient, stretching across the eastern counties of Norfolk, Cambridgeshire, and Lincolnshire in a vast patchwork of fields divided by drainage ditches called dykes, the whole system maintained by pumping stations that lifted water from field level into rivers and eventually out to the Wash and the North Sea. Below sea level in many places, the Fens existed only because of 3 centuries of continuous engineering. Dutch engineers brought over in the 17th century by the Duke of Bedford had drained what had been marsh and wetland. They created some of the most fertile agricultural land in Europe from what had previously been impassable swamp. The soil was black peat, extraordinarily rich, capable of producing yields that farmers on thin chalk soils elsewhere in England could only dream about. Sugar beet, potatoes, wheat, barley, vegetables of every kind, all growing in black earth, so dark it looked almost artificial, so fertile that farmers said you could push a stick into it and it would sprout leaves by morning. But the same richness that made fenland farming so productive also made it uniquely vulnerable. The peat shrank as it dried out, meaning the land was slowly sinking, becoming more dependent on drainage every decade, requiring constant maintenance of the dike system to prevent the flat fields from returning to the marsh they'd been before the engineers arrived. A blocked dike could drown an entire field's worth of crops within days during a wet winter. A damaged pumping station could set a farm back years financially. And deliberate interference with drainage infrastructure, blocking outflow pipes, damming ditches, redirecting water onto a neighbor's land, could be as effective a weapon as any firearm if deployed patiently and consistently over a long period of time. In a landscape where every farm's drainage connected to every other farm's drainage, water was power. And power, in the Fens, was everything. The landscape itself was extraordinary in its bleakness. Flat in every direction as far as you could see, fields stretching to a horizon so distant it seemed unnatural, sky taking up 3/4 of every view, the huge East Anglian sky that painters loved and farmers feared because it showed you weather coming from 20 miles away, but gave you nowhere to shelter from it. In February, the Fens were brutal. Wind came off the North Sea with nothing to slow it. No hills, no forests, no natural windbreaks of any kind, temperatures dropping to -5 or -10 overnight, black fields frozen solid, dikes iced over, the landscape grey and white and utterly desolate in a way that visitors found deeply unsettling, but that Fenland people had lived with for generations and simply accepted as the price of farming the most productive soil in England. Villages were small and scattered, interconnected by narrow roads that ran perfectly straight for miles, because the Dutch engineers had built them along the dike banks. Roads that flooded in winter became impassable in hard frost, isolating communities that had been isolated for centuries and had developed their own particular culture as a result. Fenland people were different from other East Anglians, different from most English people. Centuries of living in a landscape that required collective maintenance had created communities bound by mutual obligation and dependence. Everyone's drainage connected to everyone else's, meaning that bad behavior by one farmer affected all his neighbors, meaning that disputes over water management were not just private matters, but community concerns affecting livelihoods across entire parishes. At the same time, the isolation had produced independence and stubbornness, and a deep reluctance to involve outside authorities in local matters, a preference for settling things among themselves according to codes that outsiders found difficult to understand. Fenland farmers didn't call solicitors first. They talked to each other, negotiated, sometimes argued, occasionally fought, but kept things within the community. Courts and police were for serious matters, final resorts after everything else had failed. This cultural preference for internal resolution, admirable in many respects, also meant that disputes could fester for decades without the outside intervention that might have broken the cycle before it became fatal. The village of Welney sat on the border between Norfolk and Cambridgeshire, population 340 in 1971, straddling the Bedford Level, where the 100-foot River and the old Bedford River ran parallel through the landscape, two straight cuts made in the 17th century to drain the southern fens. Around Welney, the farms of various sizes worked the black peat soil, sugar beet and potatoes predominantly. Some wheat, some market gardening for the Norwich and Cambridge markets. The village had one pub called the Lamb and Flag, one church, one primary school, one post office that also sold groceries, and the kind of settled permanent community that was already becoming rare in 1971, as younger generations moved to cities for work, and the agricultural industry consolidated smaller holdings into larger mechanized operations. People in Welney in 1971 knew each other's families going back 4 and 5 generations, knew each other's business, each other's finances, each other's disputes. Nothing stayed private for long in a community that small and that isolated. The Drake Farm sat on the western edge of Welney Parish, 280 acres of black fen soil, drainage outflow running east along a shared dike boundary, before joining the main drainage channel half a mile away. The farm had been in the Drake family since 1891, when Arthur's grandfather, Edwin Drake, had purchased it from a bankrupt estate, built the farmhouse from local brick, established the drainage infrastructure, begun the slow process of making a living from fenland soil. 3 generations of Drakes had farmed the same land, each passing it on improved, expanded, better drained, more productive. Edwin had broken the first fields, laid the first dikes, installed the first drainage pumps. Arthur's father, Harold, had expanded the acreage, modernized the equipment during the agricultural boom of the First World War, established the farm's reputation for quality sugar beet that commanded premium prices from the factory in Ely. By 1971, Arthur Drake had built the operation into one of the more successful farms in the parish. 280 acres fully drained and productive, modern machinery, good consistent yields, modest prosperity that represented 80 years of family effort and investment across 3 generations. Arthur William Drake was 61 years old in February 1971, born on the farm in 1910, educated at the village school, and briefly at a grammar school in Downham Market before his father needed him back on the land at 16. He'd served in the Royal Norfolk Regiment during the Second World War, enlisted in 1939, seen action in North Africa during the Desert Campaign, and then in Italy during the grinding advance up the peninsula. He'd been at Monte Cassino, survived 4 months of the worst fighting of the Italian campaign, come home in 1945 with a military medal for actions at Cassino that his citation described as conspicuous bravery under fire, and a permanent slight limp from a shrapnel wound in his left calf that had never properly healed. He'd taken over the farm from his aging father in 1946, married a local girl named Dorothy Reeve in 1947, daughter of a Welney smallholder, and settled back into the farming life with the quiet determination of a man who'd survived things that made agricultural hardship seem manageable by comparison. Arthur was the kind of man his community respected, without necessarily finding easy company. Honest in all his dealings, hard-working to a degree that his neighbors sometimes found exhausting, fair and consistent in how he treated people, generous in practical ways when other families faced difficulties, always available to help with machinery breakdowns or difficult livestock situations or the 100 other crises that punctuated farming life. But uncompromising, inflexible, incapable of accepting situations he'd decided were wrong, unable to let things go once he'd formed a settled view. His wife Dorothy managed the social dimensions of the marriage that Arthur couldn't, maintained the friendships with neighboring families, smoothed over the minor conflicts that Arthur's bluntness occasionally created, represented the farm in the village social life that Arthur found difficult and avoided when he could. She was 58 in 1971, grey-haired and patient. He had spent 30 years managing Arthur's rigidity with quiet, practical diplomacy, understood him better than anyone else alive, and had learned to read in his silences what he would never say directly. They had 3 sons. George, born 1947, was 24 in 1971, had worked the farm since leaving school at 15, quiet and capable, resembling his father in temperament, but with enough of Dorothy's flexibility to make him easier to work with. George was engaged to a girl named Patricia Aldis from Downham Market, planning to marry in spring 1972, saving carefully for a house in the village, looking forward to a future he'd mapped out with the methodical care of someone who'd grown up watching his father plan everything carefully and execute precisely. Peter was 22, more volatile, had Arthur's stubbornness combined with less of his father's self-control, and had nearly come to blows with the Hartington family's son James, twice in the past 3 years, over minor incidents that wouldn't have troubled a calmer man. William was 19, youngest, still learning the farm's rhythms and demands, gentle-natured and somewhat bewildered by the permanent tension between his family and their eastern neighbors, the only one of the 3 sons who'd grown up, not quite understanding why the Hartington dispute consumed so much of his father's emotional energy. The Hartington farm adjoined the Drake property on the eastern boundary, 320 acres of similar soil, similar crops, similar history of family ownership stretching back to the original fenland drainage schemes of the Victorian era. But the Hartingtons and the Drakes had never been friends. There was something about the particular configuration of land between them, the shared drainage dike, the outflow channel that ran along the property line, the way water moved across the flat landscape under gravity and pump pressure, that created perpetual opportunity for conflict. Shared drainage infrastructure meant shared decisions about water levels, shared maintenance responsibilities, shared vulnerability to each other's choices about sluice gate settings and dike maintenance. And where infrastructure was shared, the opportunity for one party to benefit at the other's expense was constant and difficult to police. Or the trouble had started in 1938, 33 years before Valentine's Day, 1971. Old Thomas Hartington, Robert's father, had decided to improve his own drainage that year by raising the level of the shared outflow dike on his side of the boundary and installing a sluice gate that gave him better control of water levels on his land. The work was done quickly, while Arthur's father, Harold, was in hospital in Downham Market, having an operation on his back. By the time Harold came home and walked his eastern boundary, the sluice was installed and the dike level altered. Harold had complained immediately, in person to Thomas Hartington, in writing to the Internal Drainage Board, in conversation to anyone in Welney who would listen. Thomas had promised to adjust the sluice settings to restore adequate flow from the Drake side. He never did. The promises were made and forgotten. Made again when Harold pressed. Forgotten again. The sluice remained, as managing water primarily for Hartington's benefit. In the wet winter of 1939, the Drake Farm's eastern fields flooded for the first time in 20 years. 6 acres of sugar beet drowned in standing water that the impeded outflow dike couldn't clear fast enough, losses of several £100 at a time when Harold Drake was still recovering from his operation, and the farm's finances were already stretched. The loss was painful and concrete. The cause was clear to Harold and to Arthur, who was 29 that year and watching everything carefully. But proving deliberate interference rather than inadequate maintenance was another matter entirely, and the Internal Drainage Board, when approached, found the situation complicated and recommended negotiation. During the war years, drainage disputes were secondary to the massive expansion of agricultural production demanded by the government. War agricultural committees had real powers to compel maintenance and resolve disputes in the national interest. But after the war, when government oversight withdrew, the Hartington drainage problem resumed and intensified under Robert Hartington, who inherited the farm from his father Thomas in 1952, aged 35. Ambitious and aggressive, better educated than his father, more sophisticated in his use of official channels and professional connections. Robert expanded the farm steadily through the 1950s, buying neighboring fields as older farmers retired, improving his own drainage infrastructure with modern pumping equipment, investing profits from good sugar beet prices in further improvements. His farm became visibly more productive than the Drake operation, better drained, better equipped, more efficient, the difference visible to anyone who walked the boundary dike and looked at both sides simultaneously. And consistently, year after year, Robert Hartington managed the shared outflow dike in ways that benefited his own land while incrementally restricting drainage flow from the Drake farm. It was never dramatic, never the kind of obvious sabotage that would constitute clear evidence in a legal proceeding. Sluice gates adjusted by fractions that made technical sense individually, but collectively reduced flow capacity on the Drake side. The maintenance work on the shared dike that happened to improve Hartington's drainage while leaving Drake's slightly impeded. Drainage board meetings where Hartington's polished presentations and established relationships with officials consistently produced outcomes slightly tilted in his favor. Permission for drainage works that technically required Hartington's agreement withheld for months, while Drake's field sat waterlogged, waiting for approval that arrived too late to prevent crop damage. Arthur Drake had recognized the pattern by the early 1950s and had never stopped recognizing it. Every winter brought new variations on the same theme. Every spring brought assessment of damage, calculation of losses, decisions about whether this particular incident justified another formal complaint, another solicitor's letter, another hearing before the Drainage Board. He'd taken it to the Internal Drainage Board formally in 1955, as presenting documented evidence of flow restrictions and resulting crop losses. The board had investigated, found the situation complex, imposed minor requirements on Hartington that were never adequately enforced, recommended negotiation between the parties. Arthur had taken it back in 1961, with more documentation, more financial records of accumulated losses, expert testimony from a drainage engineer he'd paid to survey the shared dike system. The board had investigated again. I found again that the situation was complex, imposed slightly stronger requirements on Hartington, recommended mediation. He'd taken it back in 1966 and again in 1969, each time with more comprehensive documentation, each time receiving responses that acknowledged some merit in his complaint but produced insufficient remediation. The civil court case in 1963 had been Arthur's most expensive attempt at justice. He'd hired a solicitor in Downham Market, a competent man named Henderson, who specialized in agricultural disputes, spent 18 months building a case with drainage engineers and agricultural economists and historical documentation going back to the 1938 installation of the original sluice. The case had dragged through the county court for 2 years, consuming £800 that Arthur had borrowed against that year's crop income, to resulting in a judgment that acknowledged Hartington had caused some demonstrable harm to Drake's drainage, but awarded damages of only £450, insufficient to cover legal costs, let alone actual losses. The court had found that Hartington had acted within his legal rights in most technical respects, that the shared drainage arrangement needed renegotiation rather than compensation, that both parties should attempt mediation. Hartington's solicitor had sent a proposed mediation framework so favorable to his client that Arthur had refused it within the hour of receiving it. Through the 1960s, the losses accumulated with the steady rhythm of agricultural seasons. Arthur estimated, going through his records, that Hartington's management of the shared drainage had cost him between £500 and £1,500 per year in damaged crops, reduced yields on persistently waterlogged soil, additional pumping costs, do extra drainage work to partially compensate for the restricted outflow. Over 25 years, from 1945 to 1970, that represented £12,000 to £20,000 in total losses, equivalent to well over £150,000 in modern money. Not enough to destroy the farm entirely, the Drake land was productive enough that even impaired drainage generated reasonable yields, but enough to prevent the investment and modernization that would have expanded and improved the operation, enough to keep Arthur perpetually working harder than his neighbor for worse results, enough to make the comparison between the two farms, visible across the boundary dike every single day, a constant source of humiliation and rage. The three sons had grown up inside this dispute, shaped by it in ways they probably couldn't fully articulate. George had absorbed his father's methodical approach, cataloguing grievances, maintaining records, to believing ultimately that persistence through proper channels would eventually produce justice. Peter had absorbed the rage without the patience, wanted direct confrontation, had twice had to be physically restrained by his father from going over the boundary dike to confront the Hartington family personally. William had grown up confused by the whole thing, unable to understand why adults couldn't simply sort out a drainage problem sensibly, unable to see why it had to consume so much of his family's emotional life. Dorothy had watched the dispute reshape her husband over 30 years, with the quiet sadness of a woman who understood what was happening but couldn't stop it. The Arthur Drake of 1971 was harder than the man she'd married in 1947, more enclosed, less able to set the grievance aside even temporarily, less able to enjoy what was good in their life without returning eventually to what was wrong. She'd suggested selling the farm more than once during particularly bad years, moving somewhere without the constant daily reminder of the Hartington boundary. Arthur had refused each time with an intensity that told her the farm wasn't simply a business to him. It was evidence. It was the record of what his family had built and what Hartington was destroying, and leaving would mean conceding that destruction, acknowledging defeat, and that was something Arthur William Drake was constitutionally incapable of doing. In October 1970, Robert Hartington installed new drainage equipment on his eastern fields, a major investment in modern pumping infrastructure that had been partially funded by a government agricultural improvement grant. The installation was substantial: new electric pumping station, modern automated sluice gates, redesigned outflow channels on his side of the boundary. The work required modifications to the shared boundary dike that Arthur had not been properly consulted about, had not consented to, and had not been informed of in advance beyond a brief letter from Hartington's solicitor, noting that drainage improvements would be undertaken under existing planning permissions, and that no consent from adjacent landowners was legally required. The modifications were completed over 3 days in mid-October, while Arthur was in Norwich attending the funeral of his wife's brother. By the time he returned and walked his eastern boundary, the work was done. The shared dike had been raised on the Hartington side. A new automatic sluice controlled outflow through the shared channel, a sophisticated piece of equipment that could be set to maintain precise water levels on the Hartington land, regardless of conditions on the Drake side. To Arthur's eye, examining the installation with 30 years of drainage experience, it was the most comprehensive and effective version yet of what Hartington had been doing since 1938. Total control over the shared channel, total ability to manage it for his own benefit at Drake's expense, and this time with modern automated equipment rather than manually adjusted sluices. He went to the Hartington farmhouse the day after his return. Robert Hartington wasn't there. His wife Margaret said he was out, would pass on the message. Robert called back the following morning, explained pleasantly that the installation had proper permissions, that the new equipment would actually improve overall drainage in the area, that Arthur was welcome to have his own drainage engineer inspect the system if he had technical concerns. Arthur said that wasn't the point. Robert said what was the point then? Arthur said the point was 30 years of his crops being damaged by Hartington's management of shared infrastructure, and that this new installation made that worse, not better. Robert said he disagreed with that characterization. They argued for 15 minutes. Robert said he'd have his solicitor write to Arthur's solicitor if Arthur felt there were legal issues to resolve. Then he ended the call. The winter of 1970 to 1971 was the wettest in Norfolk since 1947. Rain began in earnest in October and barely stopped through January. The black peat fields saturated beyond their normal capacity, dikes running full, pumping stations working continuously across the parish. Under normal circumstances, with adequate outflow through the shared drainage channel, the Drake farm would have managed. The soil's drainage capacity was good, and Arthur's own pumping infrastructure was well maintained. But Hartington's new automated sluice, managing its settings to optimize conditions on the Hartington side, consistently restricted outflow from the Drake eastern fields during the periods of heaviest rainfall, when adequate flow was most critical. By December 1970, Arthur's eastern fields were waterlogged in ways that hadn't occurred since the worst years of the 1940s. He pumped continuously, drove the drainage as hard as his equipment would allow, walked the boundary dike daily in the December rain, watching the Hartington sluice's LED indicator lights, showing its automated settings, understanding exactly what it was doing and why. By January 1971, his entire sugar beet crop on 40 acres had been lost, the roots rotting in standing water that wouldn't clear. His winter wheat on 30 acres of eastern fields was drowned and dead, would need to be written off and the ground reploughed in spring. He was facing losses of £4,000 or more from a single season, the worst single-year damage the farm had ever experienced. Damage that threatened the operation's financial viability in a way the previous 30 years of incremental losses had not. On January 18, 1971, Arthur Drake drove to the Internal Drainage Board offices in Ely and presented his case one final time. He brought photographs of his flooded fields, brought financial records showing the season's crop losses, brought the drainage engineer's report he'd commissioned in December, documenting the flow restriction caused by Hartington's new sluice settings, brought 30 years of correspondence with the board, every previous complaint and every previous inadequate response, the complete paper record of 3 decades during which the official system had failed to protect him. He presented it all calmly, methodically, as he always did, and asked the board to use its statutory powers to require immediate adjustment of the Hartington sluice to restore adequate drainage flow to his land. The board met to consider his complaint on January 26th. Arthur attended, presented additional technical documentation, answered questions. Robert Hartington attended with his solicitor and a drainage engineer of his own, who presented counter-evidence suggesting the flow restrictions were within acceptable parameters and that the Drake Farms problems reflected inadequate maintenance of its own drainage infrastructure rather than Hartington's sluice settings. The board's letter arrived at the Drake farmhouse on February 2nd, 1971. Arthur read it at the kitchen table while Dorothy made tea and the radio played quietly in the background. The letter informed him that while the board sympathized with the difficulties he was experiencing, Hartington's drainage improvements had been properly approved under existing regulations, that the technical evidence was disputed between the parties' respective engineers, and that the board recommended the parties engage in fresh mediation to renegotiate the shared drainage arrangement on terms reflecting the changed infrastructure. The board would appoint a mediator if both parties consented. A response required within 21 days. Arthur folded the letter carefully along its original fold lines and placed it in the kitchen drawer where he kept all the correspondence, all the letters and judgments and recommendations that represented 33 years of official engagement with a problem that official processes had never solved. The drawer was nearly full. He sat looking at it for a moment, then closed it quietly. Dorothy watched his face from across the kitchen, or the face she'd been reading for 30 years, and saw in it something she hadn't seen before. Not the anger she knew, not the determined stubbornness she knew, not even the bitter frustration she'd seen in the worst years. Something quieter than all of those, something that looked like resolution. She asked him what the letter said. He told her it was the same as always. She made the tea. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the February rain continued falling on the flooded eastern fields, and the Hartington sluice continued managing the shared outflow channel according to its automated settings, and nothing indicated to anyone in Welney that anything had changed in the Drake farmhouse on the evening of February 2nd, 1971. But something had. After 33 years, Arthur Drake had run out of official channels, and a man who has run out of official channels and cannot accept defeat has only one direction left to go. Over the following days, he said less than usual, which for Arthur Drake meant saying almost nothing at all. He continued the farm's winter routines, feeding livestock, maintaining machinery, doing what needed to be done on frozen fields with the same methodical competence he'd brought to farming every day of his adult life. He reviewed his records in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table after Dorothy had gone to bed, reading through the 33-year paper record of the dispute with the attention of a man checking his work before submitting a final report. Dorothy heard him sometimes, came downstairs once to find him reading the 1963 court judgment, the document he'd paid £800 for, the one that had given him £450 in return. She made him a cup of tea and went back to bed without asking questions because she'd learned over 30 years that some of Arthur's moods required silence rather than conversation. On February 10th, Arthur told Dorothy he was going to Norwich to see his solicitor about the drainage board letter. He drove to Norwich. He didn't see his solicitor. He made 3 separate visits to agricultural suppliers and hardware merchants in and around Norwich, paying cash for items he carried back to the car in plain bags, items he locked in the farm workshop on his return, items his sons would have to reason to look for. And didn't. He came home in the late afternoon, ate the dinner Dorothy had kept warm for him, told her the solicitor had advised another round of negotiations with the drainage board, said it was frustrating, but there were still options. Dorothy looked at him when he said this, and thought for a moment she saw something that didn't match the words, some slight wrongness in the way he was presenting the information. But Arthur Drake had never lied to her in 30 years of marriage, and she didn't look for lies in his face. Over the following 3 days, he walked his eastern boundary each morning in the February frost, standing at the dike edge, looking across at the Hartington land, or at the new pumping station with its LED indicator lights, at the automated sluice managing the shared channel, standing there in the cold for longer than drainage inspection required, long enough that George asked him once if everything was all right, and Arthur said yes, just checking the ice levels on the dike, and George accepted that because his father had always been thorough about infrastructure inspection, and this wasn't remarkable behavior for Arthur Drake. On February 13th, a Saturday, Dorothy cooked a special dinner for Valentine's Day Eve. Lamb chops with roasted potatoes and carrots and gravy, Victoria sponge with cream for dessert, one of the meals she made for occasions she wanted to mark, because tomorrow was Valentine's Day, and 33 years after her wedding, she still thought that deserved acknowledging. The boys ate with them, all 3, Saturday being the one evening the whole family reliably sat down together. Conversation was ordinary, or George talking about a problem with the tractor's hydraulics, Peter complaining about fuel prices, William asking about a farming program he'd seen on television. Arthur ate steadily and said little, which was normal, and complimented the lamb, which was also normal, and helped clear the plates afterward, which was also normal. After dinner, George and Peter drove into Downham Market for the evening. William stayed home, watching television in the sitting room, or Dorothy knitted in her chair by the fire. Arthur sat with her for an hour, not reading, not speaking much, just present in a way that felt slightly different from his usual evening silences, more deliberate, more aware. When Dorothy stood up at 9:30 and said she was going to bed, Arthur stood as well, which he rarely did, and took her hand for a moment, which he also rarely did, and said good night in a way that made her pause on the stairs and look back at him. He was standing by the fireplace looking at the room, at the furniture and the photographs, and the accumulated domestic evidence of their life together, with an expression she couldn't quite read. She almost asked him something. Then she went upstairs. Arthur sat by the dead fire until after midnight. William had gone to bed at 10. The house was silent, except for wind moving around the brick walls and the distant sound of one of the drainage pumps running somewhere across the fields. At 12:30, he put on his boots and his heavy coat and went out to the workshop. He was in there for 40 minutes. When he came back to the house, he didn't go to bed. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, looking out the window at the flat, black fenland landscape under a February sky with no moon, the frozen fields extending away toward the eastern boundary where the drainage dike marked the line between what was his and what was Hartington's. He sat there for 4 hours. At 4:30 in the morning on February 14th, 1971, Valentine's Day, he stood up, put on his coat again, picked up what he'd prepared in the workshop, and walked out into the freezing darkness toward the eastern boundary of the Drake farm. The frost on the Drake Farm's eastern fields was 3 inches thick on the morning of February 14th, 1971, hard enough to hold a man's weight without cracking, the black peat beneath frozen solid, every blade of dead winter grass encased in ice that caught the faint starlight and gave the landscape a dim, cold glow. Arthur Drake crossed his own fields in darkness, moving without a torch, because he'd walked this ground every day for 61 years, and needed no light to navigate it, to boots crunching on the frost with a sound that seemed enormously loud in the February silence, though there was no one to hear it. The farmhouse lights were off behind him. The village of Welney was half a mile away, and completely dark. The nearest neighbour in any other direction was the Hartington farm, 200 yards beyond the boundary dike, and the Hartington farm was also dark, or its occupants, sleeping with the deep unconsciousness of people who have no reason to expect the morning to be different from any other morning. Arthur reached the boundary dike at approximately 4:45. The dike was frozen over completely, ice thick enough to walk on. The Hartington automatic sluice on the far bank dark and silent, its LED indicators showing red in the pre-dawn darkness. The automated settings that had been drowning his eastern fields all winter, still active even in the freeze that had temporarily made them irrelevant. He stood at the dike edge for perhaps 2 minutes, looking at the sluice, looking at the Hartington farm buildings, visible as dark shapes against a slightly lighter sky 200 yards away. Then he stepped down onto the ice, crossed the frozen dike in 4 paces, and climbed the far bank onto Hartington land for the first time in 33 years. The Hartington farmhouse was a larger, newer building than the Drake farmhouse, extended and modernized during Robert Hartington's prosperous years, double-glazed windows installed in the late 1960s, central heating, proper insulation, the visible evidence of a farm that had consistently generated more profit than its neighbor across the dike. A security light on the corner of the building was the only illumination, casting a yellow circle across the yard that Arthur moved around rather than through, keeping to the shadows along the fence line, though there was nobody watching and no reason for concealment beyond the instinct of a man trained 40 years ago to move through hostile territory without drawing fire. The farm worker's cottage stood 50 yards from the main house, a smaller brick building with 2 bedrooms, occupied since 1968 by James Hartington, Robert's son, aged 31, and his wife Caroline, aged 28, who'd moved in after their marriage, when Robert had offered them the cottage as a wedding gift. James worked the farm alongside his father, had grown up understanding the Drake dispute as background noise, something his father dealt with, something that produced occasional letters and legal correspondence, but that never seemed to affect the Hartington farm's fundamental prosperity. Aunt Caroline had grown up in King's Lynn, had no connection to the dispute at all, had married into the Hartington family and moved to Welney, because that was where James was, and where James worked, and that was where their life was going to be. She was 3 months pregnant in February 1971, a fact known to her immediate family, but not yet publicly announced. Arthur went to the farm worker's cottage first. He didn't know why he chose that order, rather than the main house, and perhaps because it was closer, perhaps because some remnant of the tactical training he'd received 30 years earlier made him want to secure the perimeter before approaching the main objective. He stood outside the cottage for a moment, listening to the silence, then tried the back door. It was unlocked. Fenland people in 1971 didn't routinely lock their doors at night. There was nowhere to run to, and everyone knew everyone, and crime was something that happened in cities. He went through the kitchen and down the short hallway to the bedroom. James and Caroline Hartington were asleep, Caroline on her side facing the wall, James on his back, both completely still in the deep sleep of people who'd been working since early morning and had no reason to expect anything except another agricultural day, beginning at 5:30 when the alarm went off. Arthur stood in the doorway for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he did what he'd come to do. He left the cottage and crossed the yard to the main farmhouse. The back door here was also unlocked. He moved through the kitchen, which smelled of last night's cooking and wood ash from the range, through the hallway, past the coats and boots lined up neatly by the door, past the telephone on its small table, past the framed family photographs on the wall, up the stairs to the master bedroom where Robert and Margaret Hartington slept. Robert was 64 years old, the man who'd spent 30 years incrementally destroying Arthur Drake's farm through careful management of shared drainage infrastructure, sleeping in his bedroom in his successful house on his prosperous farm, with no idea that Arthur Drake was standing at his bedroom door at 4:55 in the morning. Robert Hartington never woke up. Neither did Margaret. Robert's younger brother Frederick was staying in the guest room, had arrived 2 days earlier for a visit from his home in Ipswich, and was sleeping soundly when Arthur found him. Frederick was 60 years old, a retired school teacher, had nothing to do with the Drake dispute beyond being a Hartington, had never been involved in farm management, had probably never thought about drainage dikes or sluice gates in his life. Arthur killed him anyway. He would say later, at the trial, that he hadn't planned to kill Frederick, hadn't known Frederick was there, had found him in the guest room and made a decision in the moment that he would never be able to adequately explain. The judge would note in his sentencing remarks that this killing, more than any other, demonstrated the difference between grievance-driven violence and simple murder, and that Arthur Drake had crossed that line at some point in the guest room of the Hartington farmhouse. He was back in the farmyard at approximately 5:15 when the first farm worker arrived for the morning milking rotation. The Hartington farm kept a dairy herd of 60 cows in addition to the arable operation, and morning milking began at 5:30, which meant the 3 workers who shared the rotation arrived between 5:15 and 5:25, walking from their tied cottages at various points around the farm boundary, arriving in the yard as they always did. Was expecting an ordinary February morning of cold fingers and steaming cow breath and the mechanical rhythm of milking equipment. The first worker was Thomas Hodge, 53 years old, 20 years on the Hartington farm, walking across the yard with his head down against the cold when he saw Arthur Drake standing by the milking parlor door with a shotgun. Thomas stopped, looked at Arthur, looked at the shotgun. Thomas Hodge had known Arthur Drake his entire adult life. He had nodded to him across the boundary dike hundreds of times, had no quarrel with him, no connection to the drainage dispute, was simply a man who worked for the Hartington family and had arrived for work at the wrong time on the wrong morning. Arthur told Thomas to go home. Go home and stay there and say nothing until morning. Thomas looked at him for a long moment, understanding beginning to form on his face, understanding of what had already happened in the farmhouse and the cottage, and understanding that he was looking at a man who had already done something that couldn't be undone. He turned and walked back the way he'd come, quickly, not running, the walk of a man controlling panic by keeping his movements deliberate. Arthur watched him go. The second farm worker, Ronald Wells, 26 years old, 3 years on the farm, arrived 2 minutes later from a different direction and encountered Arthur before Thomas Hodge's departure had registered as a warning. Ronald was young and confused and made the mistake of asking what was going on. Arthur shot him in the farmyard. Ronald Wells was 26 years old and had nothing to do with anything except being present. The third worker, David Marsh, 44 years old, arrived from the eastern boundary path, heard the shot, stopped, tried to understand what he'd heard, then turned and ran. Arthur was faster than a man of 61 had any right to be, or David Marsh was slower than he needed to be, or the flat fenland landscape offered nowhere to run to that was far enough. David Marsh was found later that morning in the frozen field east of the farmyard, 200 yards from the farm buildings. Thomas Hodge reached his cottage, locked the door, and telephoned Welney police station from the phone in his kitchen at 5:23 a.m. The call connected to the overnight duty constable, a young man named Stevens, who was 19 months into the job and had handled nothing more serious than a road traffic accident and 2 domestic disturbances. Thomas Hodge told him that something terrible had happened at the Hartington farm, that Arthur Drake was there with a gun, that people were dead. Stevens radioed for assistance and drove to the Hartington farm alone because there was nobody else available at Welney station, and he didn't fully understand what he was driving toward. He found Arthur Drake sitting on the step of the milking parlour when he arrived at 5:41, the shotgun on the ground in front of him, hands resting on his knees, breath making slow clouds in the frozen air. Arthur looked up when the police car arrived, watched the young constable get out and approach him with the uncertain movements of someone who'd been trained for this situation, but never actually faced it, and said quietly and completely clearly that he'd done it, that it was over, dead, and that he was ready to go with them whenever they were ready. Stevens handcuffed him, which Arthur didn't resist, put him in the back of the car, and radioed for senior officers and ambulances. The bodies were found as Arthur had described them. 5 in the farmhouse and cottage, 2 in the farmyard. 7 dead, plus Ronald Wells, who died at Norfolk and Norwich Hospital at 7:15 that morning without regaining consciousness, making 8. David Marsh survived despite his wounds, but would spend 3 weeks in hospital, would carry physical damage for the rest of his life, would be the key witness whose testimony confirmed the sequence of events Arthur had already described in complete detail. Detective Chief Inspector Raymond Fowler arrived from Norwich at 7:30, by which time the Hartington farm was cordoned off and Arthur Drake was sitting in the back of a police car drinking a cup of tea someone had brought him from a flask. The Fowler interviewed him at Welney police station, beginning at 9 a.m., Arthur having waived his right to a solicitor being present on the grounds that he intended to tell them everything, and a solicitor would only slow things down. He told them everything. The 33 years of drainage dispute, the 1963 court case, the 4 internal drainage board complaints, the accumulated losses, the October installation of the new sluice, the winter flooding, the February 2nd letter, the 10 days between reading that letter and crossing the dike, what he'd done in Norwich on February 10th, what he'd done in his workshop on the night of February 13th, every step of what had happened in the early hours of February 14th, in what order, at what times, with what results. He described it in the same tone he might have used to describe a difficult harvest, factual, sequential, precise, without visible emotion. Fowler asked him at one point why he'd killed the farm workers. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Ronald Wells had asked questions and David Marsh had run, and that by that point stopping felt impossible. Fowler asked him what he meant by impossible. Arthur said he didn't know how to explain it better than that. Fowler wrote it down. It would become one of the central pieces of evidence at the trial about the question of premeditation and the limits of grievance as a motivating factor. But a man who'd planned carefully for 10 days had also made in-the-moment decisions that went beyond any plan, decisions that moved the killings from targeted revenge into something closer to massacre, and the distinction would matter enormously when the jury considered their verdict. Dorothy Drake was told at 8 a.m. by a female police officer who drove to the farmhouse while Arthur was being interviewed at the station. She sat at the kitchen table while the officer told her to sat in exactly the chair Arthur had sat in when he read the drainage board letter 12 days earlier. She asked if everyone at the Hartington farm was dead. The officer said most of them. Dorothy asked about Caroline Hartington, the daughter-in-law who was pregnant. The officer said Carolyn was dead. Dorothy sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked if she could make a cup of tea. The officer said yes, and Dorothy made tea for both of them, and they sat at the kitchen table together, while outside the February morning brightened over the frozen fenland fields. George and Peter and William were told separately as they arrived at the farmhouse throughout the morning, George coming in from the workshop at 8:30, Peter returning from the village where he'd been getting diesel at 9, William coming downstairs at 9:15 to find the house full of police. At each of their reactions was different. George went very still and said nothing for several minutes, then asked if his father was all right, meaning physically. Peter sat down on the kitchen floor when he was told, simply sat down where he was standing, and stayed there for 20 minutes. William cried, which was the reaction that looked most appropriate to outside observers, though it was the least like any of the Drakes, and the police officer present found it easier to manage than the stillness of George or the paralysis of Peter. The investigation confirmed everything Arthur had stated. Forensic evidence from the farmhouse and cottage was consistent with his account of events. Ballistics matched the Drake farm weapons recovered from the workshop. Footprints in the frost crossing the boundary dike were photographed and documented. The timeline he'd described was confirmed by Thomas Hodges' testimony and the arrival records of the farm workers. Arthur had made no attempt to conceal anything, had prepared no cover story, had left evidence that pointed directly and immediately to him. It was not an investigation that required significant detective work. It was a documentation exercise, recording what had happened, as Arthur Drake had already described it. But the Crown Prosecution Service prepared its case through spring and summer 1971. The charges were 9 counts of murder, 1 count of manslaughter, having been briefly considered for the Ronald Wells killing before being rejected, given Arthur's clear testimony that the decision had been deliberate. Arthur's solicitor, a competent man from Norwich named Harrison, who'd handled several murder cases, built a defense around provocation, diminished responsibility, and the systematic failure of official processes to protect his client over 30 years. Harrison commissioned psychiatric reports, agricultural economists to quantify the losses Arthur had suffered, drainage engineers to document the Hartington sluice's effect on Drake land, legal historians to document the inadequacy of the Internal Drainage Board's responses to Arthur's complaints. He built a genuinely substantial case for the proposition that Arthur Drake was a man who had been systematically failed by every institution he'd approached for help, and had reached a breaking point that a reasonable person in his circumstances might understand, if not condone. The trial opened at Norwich Crown Court on September 14th, 1971. The courtroom was full every day, journalists from national papers alongside local reporters, the farming community representatives who understood the drainage dispute in ways the urban press struggled to explain to their readers, legal observers interested in the provocation defense and its potential implications for agricultural dispute law. Arthur Drake sat in the dock throughout, in a dark suit that Dorothy had bought him for the occasion, quiet and attentive, answering questions when asked, watching the proceedings with the focused attention of a man who understood that this was the final official process, the last time any institution would engage with the question of whether what had happened in the Norfolk Fens on Valentine's Day, 1971, could be explained, if not justified. Harrison's examination of Arthur lasted 2 days. Arthur described the 33 years of dispute in the same methodical, documented way he'd described everything else, year by year, complaint by complaint, A loss by loss, the accumulated record of a man who'd kept meticulous records because he'd always believed that evidence and process would eventually produce justice. The jury listened. Several of them were taking notes. The judge, Justice Crawford, a man of 60, who'd spent 30 years in agricultural law before elevation to the bench, listened with particular attention, asking occasional clarifying questions about drainage infrastructure and internal drainage board procedures that suggested he understood the technical context better than many judges would have. The prosecution's cross-examination took 3 days and focused primarily on the 3 victims with the least connection to the dispute: Frederick Hartington, the visiting brother; Ronald Wells, the young farm worker; and the unborn child of James and Caroline Hartington, whose death had been included in the charge relating to Caroline. The prosecution barrister, Chambers, was methodical and unemotional, returning again and again to the question of choice. Arthur Drake had chosen to cross the dike, had chosen to kill people who were asleep and unable to defend themselves or flee, had chosen to kill a young farm worker who'd done nothing more than ask a question, had chosen, in other words, not to stop at the point where the grievance had been addressed, but to continue until 9 people were dead, including people who had no connection to 33 years of drainage disputes. Chambers asked Arthur at one point whether he'd known Caroline Hartington was pregnant. Arthur said he hadn't. Chambers asked whether it would have made a difference. Arthur was silent for a long moment. Then he said he didn't know. Chambers sat down. Harrison didn't re-examine on that point. The psychiatric evidence occupied 4 days of testimony. 3 psychiatrists had examined Arthur, 2 instructed by the defense, and 1 by the prosecution. All 3 agreed that Arthur Drake was sane in the legal sense, understood what he'd done, understood that it was wrong under the law. The defense psychiatrists argued that 33 years of cumulative stress and institutional failure had produced a form of psychological exhaustion that significantly impaired his judgment, or that the decision to cross the dike had not been the product of a fully functioning rational mind, but of a mind ground down to a point where normal inhibitions no longer operated. The prosecution psychiatrist argued that the planning involved, the trip to Norwich, the careful preparation over 10 days, demonstrated preserved rational function inconsistent with the kind of diminished responsibility the defense was arguing. But Justice Crawford, summing up, would note that the psychiatric evidence on both sides was credible and that the jury would need to weigh it carefully against the evidence of planning and deliberation. Harrison's closing speech lasted 4 hours, one of the longer closing arguments Norwich Crown Court had heard in several years, ranging across the history of the Hartington drainage dispute, the failures of the Internal Drainage Board, the 1963 court case, the accumulated losses, the final winter of flooding, and building toward the argument that while 9 deaths were indefensible and the law had no mechanism to justify them, the jury should understand what those deaths represented in human terms, the end point of a journey that had begun with a sluice gate installed in 1938 and had never been adequately addressed by any official body that had the power to address it. He asked the jury not to acquit, knowing they couldn't, but to convict on the lesser grounds that would allow the judge to reflect in his sentence the 33 years of context that preceded the 14 hours of February 14th, 1971. Chambers' closing was shorter, 40 minutes, and returned to the 9 dead with the relentlessness of a man who knew the facts were on his side. 9 people, 3 of them with no conceivable connection to drainage disputes. A pregnant woman, a retired school teacher visiting his brother, or a young farm worker doing his job. Whatever Arthur Drake had suffered, 9 people were dead who might otherwise have lived for decades. The law had no category for justified murder, The jury's job was to determine the facts and apply the law. The jury retired on October 19th, 1971, and returned on October 21st after 22 hours of deliberation, guilty on all 9 counts of murder. No recommendation for mercy. Justice Crawford sentenced Arthur Drake to life imprisonment on each count. Sentences to run concurrently, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. Crawford noted in his sentencing remarks that he had read every piece of evidence relating to the 33-year drainage dispute and found it credible and, in many respects, damning of the institutions that had failed to resolve it, that Arthur Drake had legitimate grievances that legitimate processes had failed to adequately address, and that none of that changed the fact that 9 people were dead and that the defendant had killed them. He expressed particular concern about the deaths of Frederick Hartington and the farm workers, deaths that went beyond any proportionate response to the drainage dispute, and demonstrated that at some point in the early hours of February 14th, Arthur Drake had moved from grievance into something that the law could only call murder in its simplest sense. But Arthur Drake was taken from Norwich Crown Court to H.M. Prisons, Norwich, later transferred to H.M. Prison Blunderston in Suffolk, where he remained for the rest of his sentence. He appealed the conviction in 1973, the appeal dismissed. He applied for parole in 1983, denied. He applied again in 1987, denied again on grounds that he had never fully engaged with rehabilitation programs and had never expressed what the parole board considered genuine remorse for the killings beyond the procedural acknowledgments of wrongdoing that anyone navigating the prison system would make. He died at Blunderston on March 3, 1989, 18 years into his sentence, aged 79, heart failure in the prison medical wing. It is exactly the death Justice Crawford had essentially predicted when he noted that 25 years minimum meant a 61-year-old man would likely die in custody. Dorothy Drake died in 1981, 10 years after Arthur's conviction, in the farmhouse where she'd lived her entire married life. She'd visited Arthur regularly throughout, taking the bus to Blunderston every month until her health made it impossible. She never spoke publicly about the case, never gave interviews to the journalists who occasionally approached her in the years after the trial, when interest in the case was periodically revived. George, Peter, and William attended the farm sale in 1974, after financial pressures made continuation impossible, and stood in the yard while the auctioneer sold the machinery and equipment, the same machinery and equipment their grandfather and father had accumulated over 80 years of fenland farming. My George moved to Lincolnshire with Patricia, whom he'd married despite everything, worked on larger arable farms as a labourer, never owned land again. Peter moved to Scotland as planned, and worked in construction, changed his name, cut all contact. William moved to Norwich, worked in a warehouse, married, had children who grew up not knowing their grandfather's story. The Internal Drainage Board produced recommendations following the case, and the government commissioned a review of agricultural dispute resolution procedures that was published in 1973 and led to new mediation requirements for shared drainage arrangements that reduced the likelihood of disputes persisting unresolved for decades. Agricultural lawyers have cited the Drake case in academic literature as an example of institutional failure with catastrophic consequences, a case study in what happens when legitimate grievances are processed but never resolved. Whether those reforms would have saved 9 lives if they'd existed in 1938 is a question nobody can answer. The Hartington farm was sold through estate litigation in 1974, purchased by an agricultural company that amalgamated it with neighbouring holdings into a larger mechanized operation. The farmhouse where Robert and Margaret Hartington died was demolished in 1979. The farm workers' cottage where James and Caroline Hartington died was converted into a holiday cottage in the mid-1980s and is still rented to tourists who come to the Fens to watch the winter floods that the drainage systems now mostly manage but never entirely prevent. The boundary dike between the old Drake and Hartington land is still there, maintained as part of the Bedford-level drainage system, although the automated sluice that Robert Hartington installed in October 1970 was replaced in 1976, and nobody working the drainage system today knows its history. In Welney, people who were alive in 1971 remember Arthur Drake not simply as a murderer, but as something more complicated, a man who was wronged for 30 years and responded with terrible disproportionality, a man whose story makes simple moral judgments feel inadequate, even though the moral judgment is clear enough. 9 people are dead. Whatever preceded it, that's what Arthur Drake did on Valentine's Day, 1971, in the flattest, quietest corner of England, in a landscape where water runs downhill so slowly you can barely see it moving, where the drainage of one field connects to the drainage of the next, where what happens on one side of a boundary affects what happens on the other side, and where a man who felt that connection being used against him for 33 years finally decided he'd had enough. This is Dark Chronicles UK. Subscribe for more stories they tried to bury. And remember, in England's quiet countryside, the most dangerous disputes are often the ones that nobody notices until it's far too late.